Greetings, I'm Simone Sanders Townsend in for Stephanie Ruhle. We are now 259 days away from the midterms, and the administration is trying to put the Epstein files behind them. Over the weekend, Attorney General Pam Bondi notified Congress that all the materials had been released, along with an explanation of all the redactions made, plus a list of public figures whose names appear in the files. Here's a reminder. The Epstein Transparency Act that Trump signed into law actually required the Department of Justice to publicly release all of the Epstein files and to explain its redactions to Congress. But the deadline was nearly 2 months ago, and lawmakers, they are not satisfied. The Democratic co-author of the bill, Congressman Ro responded on social media, quote, "The Department of Justice, or DOJ, is once again purposefully muddying the waters on who was a predator and who was mentioned in an email." His Republican counterpart, Congressman Thomas Massie, took it a step further yesterday.
I don't think Pam Bondi has confidence in Pam Bondi. She wasn't confident enough to engage in anything but name-calling in a hearing. And so, no, I don't have confidence in her. She hasn't got any sort of accountability there at the DOJ. When I asked her specifically who redacted Leslie Wexner's name from the one document that mattered, she couldn't give me an answer. She wouldn't give me an answer. But ultimately, it's her who is responsible for the document production.
Across Washington, the Department of Homeland Security is shut down, and the employees are going without pay as outrage over ICE and Border Patrol's aggressive tactics hold up funding negotiations. With that, let's bring in our leadoff panel. Michael Chanel is MSNOW congressional reporter. Susan Glasser is here. She's a staff writer for The New Yorker. And Barbara McQuaid, a veteran federal prosecutor and former U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan. All right, let's start with you, Michael. Is there enough support in Congress to force the Department of Justice to follow the law? Obviously, Democratic members of Congress have said that they are not taking the steps yet to sue because they need Republicans. We've heard talks about a discharge petition. Tell us what you know.
I can tell you that members on both sides of the aisle are not happy with how this process has been handled. And we know that's old news, right? That's been the case for a few weeks now. But the letter that was sent over the weekend has only inflamed those feelings. Since these documents started being released by the Department of Justice, there have been a number of concerns raised about these redactions. Victims' names, victims' personal identification information being shown out to the public, and then names of high-powered, high-profile individuals, theirs were being covered by redactions. A number of lawmakers on both sides of the aisle raised concerns about that. Now, what they were all looking forward to was this letter that the DOJ, by law, was required to send Congress. They hoped they would give some clarity on these redactions. In fact, the concerns about the redactions were only inflamed when members of Congress started going behind closed doors to view the unredacted materials. Finally, after weeks, that letter came this weekend, and it has only made matters worse for members. They're still unhappy with how the redactions were handled, and now they have this list of about 300 individuals whose names were mentioned in the files, and there's no differentiation between folks who were maybe in emails of news digests and news articles and those who were actually involved with Jeffrey Epstein. Ro said it's muddying the waters. So what action comes next? It remains unclear at this moment. Congress is out of session until next week. But certainly the frustrations have only grown after that letter was released.
It was literally just an aggregated list that included, for instance, President Obama, even though we know he doesn't show up in the files. It is a news article, but
Janis Joplin,
exactly, who was 17 years old when Jeffrey. But you know, what are the facts matter here? Susan, and I'm being facetious for the people at home. Susan, okay, this list of public figures that we're talking about, to the point that Michael just made, it included people who are long dead. Marilyn Monroe was on the list. Elvis Presley was on the list. Ronald Reagan was on the list. Also alongside people who had established connections with Epstein. So it seems like muddying the waters to me, but I guess the question is, what is actually the goal in doing this?
Well, look, let's put the context here around the Justice Department over the last year. If Congress has pretty much gotten out of the accountability and oversight business. They passed this law, but the Republican-controlled Congress in both the House and the Senate over the last year has basically made it very clear that when it comes to the standing up for the institutional prerogatives of Congress versus the executive branch, they're not going to do it. And so then the question is really, do we have any reasonable expectation on the part of the Justice Department that anyone's going to hold them accountable if they simply flout Congress here. What's the remedy for producing documents like this that clearly are almost insulting to the intention of the law? You know, the question is, what, if anything, is Congress going to do about it? And I'm very skeptical about that. And then you look at, in a bigger picture sense, well, why did we release these documents? There was a hope that there might finally be accountability. It seems like there's accountability for certain private citizens or people in academia or people in foreign countries. You know, the Prime Minister of Great Britain is embroiled in a scandal involving Jeffrey Epstein. He never even met Jeffrey Epstein, but there's members of Donald Trump's cabinet. There's Donald Trump himself who don't seem to be interested at all in answering questions about their closer relationship with Jeffrey Epstein.
You know, Barb, one of the issues people have, and I mean members of Congress, lawyers, former Department of Justice officials have said to me is that the Epstein Files Transparency Act, part of the reason it could get passed, one of the compromises was it didn't have enforcement teeth, if you will. So I put that on the table because Nancy Mace responded to this letter from Pam Bondi on social media. And this is what she said, quote, citing work product privilege will not save the DOJ from releasing all the Epstein files. I'm not an attorney, and even I know this won't hold up in a court of law. Well, Barb, you're a lawyer. Is she right?
Well, she's right in terms of the language, but the question is, will they get to a court of law? So one of the things that we know from Todd Blanche is that the Justice Department withheld some of the material on the grounds that it would reveal the deliberative processes of the Department of Justice, which is protected, they say, by executive privilege. Ordinarily, that's true, but the case law typically says Congress may override that if it explicitly passes legislation that says so. The Epstein Files Transparency Act does just that. It says that the Justice Department should produce all of the memos and communications about charging decisions or decisions declining to file charges. That's, I think, what we really want to see here, right? Why were certain people charged, certain people not charged? Why did Alex Acosta give that sweetheart deal to Epstein back in 2008? Those are the kinds of questions I think people have. And Nancy Mace is right that because of that explicit demand that those documents be turned over, the Justice Department is directed to do so. Now, what if they simply say, make me, which it seems to be what they are doing here? I think they have a couple of options. I think the first step is to bring in Todd Blanche or Pam Bondi, and if they refuse to answer these questions or produce these documents, hold them in contempt. That's one option. I think another option is to file a lawsuit against the Department of Justice. We've seen this before. Remember in Trump's first term when we saw a congressional committee sue President Trump for failure to turn over his tax records? That went to the Supreme Court, and ultimately that committee prevailed. Of course, when we've got a Republican majority running Congress, it seems unlikely that we will see that step taken, at least now, unless we see a flip in the House in the 2026 midterms.
Barb making it plain, because the question I had was, in fact, about the lawsuits and what steps could be taken. Who knows what is going to happen over the next couple of days? We will be watching on this point. Michael, can I ask you about Steve Bannon? Because Michael Flynn is actually now saying that Steve Bannon should be questioned about his involvement with Jeffrey Epstein. In a statement to the New York Times, this is what Steve Bannon said, quote, I'm a filmmaker and TV host with decades of experience interviewing controversial figures. That's the only lens through which these private communications should be viewed. Now, here's the thing. Michael Flynn is not asking for him to be interviewed because of his random connection with Jeffrey Epstein and the accusations of trafficking. Michael Flynn seems to be concerned about the conversations about the 25th Amendment that were happening during Donald Trump's first term. So what is actually going on here? Because Jeffrey Epstein in the files that I saw tells someone else in an email exchange that he and Bannon have become friends.
Yeah, so Michael Flynn is coming into the conversation, as you mentioned, as part of, because of this email, this text conversation between Steve Bannon and Jeffrey Epstein that was unearthed in the files that essentially had them discussing the 25th Amendment, which says that if enough folks in the cabinet say that the president is unfit to be serving, then that's a way to remove the president. Now, Michael Flynn came in and said that this is concerning and he should have to answer questions about the 25th Amendment. At the time, there were a lot of conversations quietly behind closed doors happening. If it was being perpetrated by Steve Bannon and Jeffrey Epstein, that's a problem and that needs to be discussed. So that's why General Flynn is in this part of the conversation. But I think it begs a greater conversation about the relationship between Jeffrey Epstein and Steve Bannon. There are hours of video in these Epstein documents and this trove of information from Jeffrey Epstein and Steve Bannon. There are a number of documents, messages, emails, text messages between the two individuals. Now, will we see the House Oversight Committee actually try to subpoena Steve Bannon to bring him in to speak? Unlikely. To Barb's point, right now we're dealing with the Oversight Committee that's controlled by Republicans. You don't typically see them subpoena and go after someone who's close to the president or just big in the MAGA Republican world. Is it possible? Sure. The committee has been going after a lot of folks. Les Wexner is going to testify later this week. The Clintons are set to testify next week. But will we see Steve Bannon come before the committee to answer questions? Probably not. But General Flynn is looking at it from a 25th Amendment standpoint. But again, this begs the larger conversation of what exactly was the relationship between Jeffrey Epstein and Steve Bannon.
Yeah, Steve Bannon actually appears in the Epstein files multiple times because he and Epstein were literally communicating daily at one point. Well, Barb, Michael puts an interesting question on the table. My question is about what the survivors want, because Congressman Massey has said that the survivors want some of the men that they've implicated to be prosecuted. And I want to know, is that something that could happen? Because it doesn't seem like the Department of Justice is actually interested in that avenue. You've got the Attorney General saying, you know, case closed, essentially.
Yeah, which is interesting, isn't it, Simone? Because remember a few months ago, before the files were released, Pam Bondi announced in response to a demand from Donald Trump that she was reopening the Epstein case with regard to Democrats and was going to investigate that. But recently we heard Todd Blanche, the Deputy Attorney General, say he expected no more charges to be filed. So I don't think we're going to see anything more out of this Justice Department. Now, of course, that because there's no statute of limitations on the abuse of children, we could see it resuscitated if there is a new administration. I also read recently that New Mexico state authorities plan to look into allegations of misconduct at Jeffrey Epstein's ranch in that state. So that could bring some criminal investigation and perhaps accountability to people who abuse children at that location. But I also think there's another avenue of redress that's available here. And one of the reasons it may be that survivors are still so frustrated, and that is civil remedies, filing civil lawsuits against some of the perpetrators of these acts. Looking at the documents, one of the things that has been surprising to me is how much of these documents has been redacted. Certainly the names and personal information of survivors should be redacted, but we have page after page after page of the reports of interviews with the survivors. It seems to me that that information about the perpetrator ought to be made public. You can certainly remove the name and identifying information, but not the content of what the survivors told the investigators, because that's the kind of information that a civil lawyer could use to perhaps file a civil lawsuit and hold some of these men accountable.
Susan, before we go, new topic. Employees at agencies like TSA, FEMA, even the Coast Guard, they are right now going without pay. This is because negotiations on the Hill are stalled over ICE and Border Patrol's conduct. Before we came on air, Michael noted in her reporting that Schumer's spokesperson has said that they have submitted a counter proposal to the Republican proposal. We don't know the details of that. We don't know the details of the Republicans' proposal either, to be honest. So how long do you see all of this lasting?
Well, unfortunately, I think the fear is that unless conditions change, the politics change, the administration could up the pressure on Democrats by doing things like, pulling back, saying TSA doesn't have the resources, lines at airports get long, there's more of a public outcry. That's kind of one of the scenarios that broke the last shutdown fight between Democrats and Republicans. I could see that playing out, but probably not right away. This is the shutdown, the mini shutdown focus just on the Department of Homeland Security, that, essentially the ICE overreach in Minnesota wrought. If it weren't for what we all saw happening in Minnesota in January, including the killings of Alex Pretty and Renee Good, we probably wouldn't be in this shutdown, because I think Democrats felt politically this is what they needed to do, is to try to impose more restrictions on the ways in which these ICE immigration surges could operate in the country. I think there's enormous support at this point for this. You look at the poll numbers, they suggest the public has absolutely lost faith in how the Department of Homeland Security is carrying out this mission. But what's going to happen when it affects people more broadly? That's an interesting question. If it starts hitting airports and emergency aid and things like that, the Department of Homeland Security is this incredible hybrid agency, and it's not possible at this point just to focus on the immigration piece of it. And so, I don't see any sign of quick movement here. Neither party seems eager to give in at the moment. So unfortunately, I suspect this is going to last for a little bit while longer.
Michael, we've got about a minute left. Congress is on recess till, I believe, February 23rd. So is there going to be any movement before then?
I don't think so. And I don't think there's going to be movement until well after that date also. I was texting with a House Republican earlier today who sits on the House Appropriations Committee, which is in charge of government funding. I said, when do you think this thing is going to wrap up? And the member said to me, your guess is as good as mine. Lawmakers are sort of just bearing here for the long haul. And the reason why is this is only about 4% of federal agency funding. So it's a small subset, but it's a big deal because DHS is a huge department with a lot of agencies. But the reason why there hasn't been so much urgency here is because as part of the reconciliation bill passed over the summer, DHS got $178 billion. Part of that chunk of money, $75 billion goes to ICE, $65 billion goes to Customs Border Protection. So there's still plenty of money for those agencies to continue their immigration crackdown, which is why this isn't such a priority for Republicans and others to come to a full year deal. Now, when is the pressure going to start to come on? Susan's exactly right. Keep an eye on something like TSA. It's what broke the shutdown last year. Now, in terms of the dates, the next payday for TSA is February 26th, next week. They're going to get a partial paycheck. They're going to get paid for last week. They're not going to get paid for this week. The first paycheck that TSA agents are going to completely miss is not until March 12th. It's a very far time away. It's a long time away, which means we really could be here for a long time, because it's not until those agents are not getting paid, they maybe don't show up, right? Lines are longer, flight cancellations. That's when the pressure starts to come, and that's one of the pain points that we talk about in these shutdowns. If that doesn't start to take effect until around March 12th, we could really be in this for the long haul.
I feel for those TSA agents and the folks at FEMA who are working very hard to make sure we all get to where we need to go safely, yet they are caught in the political crosshairs. Michael, Susan, Barbara, thank you all very, very much. Coming up later in the show, Americans are growing more and more upset with our economy and Trump's big promises to help. Over the weekend, we heard from former President Barack Obama for the first time since President Trump posted, then removed, a video with very racist imagery of Obama and his wife, Michelle. Here's what he told Brian Tyler Cohen on the host's No Lie podcast.
There's this sort of clown show that's happening in social media and on television. And what is true is that there doesn't seem to be any shame about this among people who used to feel like you had to have some sort of decorum and a sense of propriety and respect for the office, right? So that's been lost.
President Obama also brought some of his trademark hope when he talked about the people standing up for their neighbors on the streets of Minneapolis.
That kind of heroic, sustained behavior in sub-zero weather by ordinary people is what should give us hope. And it should remind us that at the end of the day, the way we get a democracy that's working, the way we get policies that actually are helping working families get ahead, the way that we restore norms, rule of law, decency, it's going to be because we, citizens, are activated and paying attention and saying enough.
Joining me now is Jason Johnson, a politics and journalism professor at Morgan State University. He's also an MSNOW political contributor. And Mark McKinnon, former advisor to both George W. Bush and John McCain. Thank you both for being here. You know, Jason, it was Mrs. Michelle Obama that said, when they go low, we go high. She was recently asked about that in another podcast interview, and she reiterated that going high is a long-term strategy. What did you make of these comments from former President Obama?
He is moisturized, unbothered, and disinterested. I mean, one of the things that I have loved about former President Barack Obama is he doesn't sweat the small stuff. He never does. He doesn't take the bait from Republicans. He doesn't take the bait from Trump. And I love how we have spent more time talking about it than he did. He said, look, most people don't care about this. Most people are disappointed in this. And let's move to taking this country forward. And that's what I have always loved about President Barack Obama. For all the criticisms I have of him, he knows that to get caught up, whether it was John Boehner, whether it was Joe Wilson, he knows to get caught up in the bigotry and the nonsense is not what America needs to be about. It needs to be about moving forward and attacking the problems that we all face, not the people who have individual issues with us.
You know, I think it's a really important point because, Mark, on one hand, Democrats have been talking about getting back to decency and civility for about 10 years now. And I do think there's a question out there about how voters see that message. But when I heard this interview with former President Obama, I was reminded of the fact that some of these folks, a lot of the people that voted for Trump, they also voted for Obama twice. You know, he understands that there's levels and nuance here. What did you think?
Well, I think I missed that guy. That's when I see that. And, you know, coincidentally, also my former boss, George W. Bush, just came out with an essay on President's Day about the humility of our first president, George Washington, and all the other characteristics of the first president. The 1-2 punch of Obama and Bush, mostly subtle, but also some little bit of an elbow jab here and there. But the message is clear from both of them that, you know, just a message of civility and decorum. Also makes me think of John McCain, who talked about serving a cause greater than yourself when you have a president who serves the cause, which is only himself. So, listen, I think it serves to remind us about what leadership really looks like in the classic sense, not in the sense that Trump is trying to redefine it. It makes us, a lot of us ache for it.
Mark, do you think we need to hear more from former President Bush? I mean, President Obama, this is the first time he spoke out about those comments about the video, but we have heard a lot from him in very clear terms. And I read former President Bush's Substack article. I thought it was very good, but it wasn't as pointed. What do you think?
I think people get the message. I think they know exactly how he feels from the very first day when he was at Trump's speech. He has chosen to stay under the radar purposefully. And I think he's done it in a very classy way. And I think he's, people may have questions about how, you know, his term as president, but I think he's been an excellent ex-president. And I think a lot of people agree with that.
Jason, I know Jason probably is. Jason might have thoughts, but I think that the point here for me in asking about President Bush is that this is some people would argue a 5-alarm fire, and This is also an election year for a midterm, but also we're looking to a presidential in 2028, and President Obama has presented one way of how to counteract and deal with the moment that we currently find ourselves in. And you've got other folks like Gavin Newsom, right, who, I mean, I think it's very clear he is thinking about running for president, like many Democrats out
he's got
there,
the running
frankly.
shoes on.
Well, child, he laced them up.
Exactly,
I don't know if he's taken off on the block yet, but we'll wait to see. But he has taken a different tact. He's given what Trump is giving. You know, he's taken to trolling him online. How do you think the two messages are obviously very different, and I think some people like the punch that Gavin Newsom is giving, but is that going to win him any votes down the line?
It probably will, because let's be honest, there is a revisionism, about decency and narratives in this country, right? At one point, the idea of saying either you're with us or against us was considered non-civil. Let's be honest about how we got to where we are now. Now we have a president that does AI videos of dumping feces on protesters. Right? So at this point, the discourse has gotten so coarse that someone like Gavin Newsom, who makes fun of the president, somebody like AOC, who makes fun of the president, somebody like Zoran Mandani, who goes to the president's White House and has Trump himself saying, all right, you can tell him I'm a fascist.
He's like, I like him.
I like him. What am I going to do? Yeah, that's what people want. They want someone who's going to be authentic. I think we are in a good way. We are in a say it to my face era of American politics, and the politicians who are willing to say, I like this, I don't like this, I like you, I don't like you, those are the people that are going to be successful. This mealy-mouthed, centrist nonsense is how Democrats got to where they are today, and that's not going to work in 2026, and it definitely won't work in 2028.
Well, Mark, Peter Baker, a friend with the New York Times, he actually wrote a piece about how Trump has gone all in on putting his name and image everywhere that he can, trying to build out what he has this so-called cult of personality that he writes. How do Republicans win in November if Donald Trump is more concerned about his ballroom and renaming Dulles Airport, which I think is a function of his former life, right? It's how he made a name for himself prior to the presidency, that and these TV shows. He's more concerned with that than improving the economy for working folks. How are Republicans going to come out successful in this midterm?
Great question. I think it's a big problem. I think it's pretty clear that Donald Trump is increasingly obsessed about his legacy. I think when voters look at him wanting to rename airports after himself, after tearing down the east wing of the White House, and his press secretary saying that that's his focus now. If he's focusing on monuments and ballrooms, that's not what working class folks around the country are thinking about these days. And so, the first thing a president's got to do is acknowledge the pain that people are feeling. And when all he's doing is talking about renaming airports and building monuments to himself, that's a pretty tough sell in November for the midterms.
Very much so. Primary season is upon us, literally. Texas early voting starts tomorrow. Jason, Mark, I know we will all be chatting very much about this in the weeks to come. Thank you. When we come back, Trump made promise after promise to make life more affordable for Americans. Mark just alluded to it. It's time for my favorite segment of this show, Money, Power, Politics. And in case you missed it, the president declared victory over the affordability crisis. Now, that might be news to the more than 60% of Americans who are very concerned about the price of health care, housing, and food. And normally, we spend a lot of time in this segment looking at all the ways Trump's policies are impacting your finances. But I want to take a moment to look at things Trump has promised to do about affordability that aren't hitting your wallet, like $5,000 DOGE dividend checks, or $2,000 tariff dividend checks, or $1,000 savings checks from expiring health care subsidies. There's a pattern here. Catch on. You remember those? Okay, folks, those checks never arrived. But we know what has arrived. There's been higher health care costs, more tariffs, and a whole lot of uncertainty. David Gura joins me now. He is a correspondent from Bloomberg and the host of the podcast, The Big Take. And John Harwood, a veteran Washington correspondent, distinguished fellow at Duke University, and columnist for Zatea on Substack. David, I mean, there's a long, really just a growing list of unfulfilled promises. And I'm a former strategist, and I can tell you that is not what you want right before midterm elections. Do you think the stimulus checks were ever really in the cards?
I think that, as you pointed out, he's grasped that over and over again, and there's a whole economic argument against it that would fuel inflation if he were to do it. But it seems like the one mechanism he keeps reaching for, yet he's not deploying it at the end. Look, he has promised to lower prices. That was the fundamental promise of his campaign. And there was a moment a couple months back at the Federal Reserve's press conference when Jay Powell, the Fed chair, said, if you were to strip away the tariffs that were in place, inflation would be back around that 2% target that the Fed has. So it's the tariffs that have caused inflation to be where it is, higher than the Fed wants it to be. This is a persistent problem, a nagging problem for this president. You mentioned the uncertainty. That's another thing that's just added additional fuel to the fire here. Americans are rightly concerned about how much groceries cost, if they're able to get houses or buy cars. All the while, we have a president who's talking about vegetarianism in Greenland, talking about the prospects of there being war in the Middle East. These are things that are far afield from what most Americans are worried about right now, and that's really the crux of the fundamental issue here for Americans today.
There's a disconnect, it feels like. And, you know, John, the president did run on fixing the economy and easing Americans' affordability concerns. But as we've just laid out, that hasn't happened yet. he promised these checks, and it made me think back to during COVID, the stimmies, as the young people call them, the stimulus checks that went out. The president signed his name to them, and there are many people to this day that say, I remember when Trump gave us the check during COVID and it was very helpful. Now, Congress was actually the ones that gave out the check, but the president very smartly, I would argue, put his name on them. Voters are, though, still struggling to put food on the table. The checks have not come. Do you think he's disconnected? Do you think he's out of touch?
He's totally disconnected. It makes absolutely no sense for him to declare victory on the economy. First of all, let's just level set for a minute. He inherited a very good economy from Joe Biden. He said it was terrible. It was not terrible. It was good. He has not made it better. As David said, he promised to lower prices. He hasn't done that. Inflation was trending down, and it trended down in the first couple of months of his presidency. Liberation Day happened, and it spiked back up. So inflation will end 2025 slightly lower than it was in 2024, but not as low as it would have been if he hadn't put the tariffs on. That has injected uncertainty into the economy. The job market has dramatically cooled down. It's not as easy to get a job as it was before. It's not a terrible economy. We're growing. We're not in recession. Unemployment remains relatively low. But the point is, it wasn't bad when he got it, and it's not better after a year of his presidency. And that is not the story that he told.
Well, people are not feeling it in their wallets at the grocery store. I mean, beef is up about 15% right now. David, Philip Bump has a piece for MSNOW, and this is what he wrote. That elderly Americans are the ones propping up this economy. There's growing demand for health care aides and nursing home and retirement care, but basically everywhere else, hiring is stalled. So what is happening here? Because healthcare is key, and I mean, it is expensive, not to mention the fact that there are so many people right now that, because of the changes last year, they can't afford their healthcare. There are many people that are going without.
As you know, few people are better with charts than Philip Bump, and it's a great piece because he looks at the decline that we've seen in public sector jobs as a result of the president and DOJ cutting all of the federal jobs that we've seen him cut over the last couple of years. He talks a lot about there being a renaissance in manufacturing this country that has not come to pass. And so when he drills into the data there so well, he sees that there has been this growth among healthcare workers, home health aides, and it tells this story of demographics in this country, that's where the growth is. That's important. I don't mean to diminish that people need that kind of help as they get older, but really what he has promised, and we've talked about the promise of lowering prices, another promise here is kind of wider gains in the job market. And what you see there in stark relief is that's not happening. We're not seeing a whole lot of growth, certainly not in the public sector, but in other parts of the private sector. It really is confined to this one space here of healthcare and home health workers and to an extent some education jobs as well.
And Simone, there are two ways in which this underscores, what Philip wrote about underscores the ways in which Donald Trump's mass deportation agenda is unwise, not just on a moral basis, but on an economic basis. Where do those home health workers come from? Many, many of them are immigrants. And we need that labor force to take care of the growing number of boomers who are retiring. The second thing is, all those boomers who are retiring are getting Social Security and Medicare. How do we finance those programs? We need taxpayers to finance those programs. The generations behind us, me, the baby boomers, are not numerous enough to continue funding those benefits. We need those immigrant workers, and the president seems to be acting on the basis of a belief that if the country becomes less white, it's a less satisfactory country. But economically, that is not at all the case.
David, I mean, I just don't understand. The numbers are very clear here, right? Sometimes, you know, when you work at the White House, you kind of get mired up in the data from the NEC and the meetings and whatnot. But literally, if you just go outside and talk to any regular person, even people that seem to be doing very well in this country, they will tell you they feel squeezed and they are struggling. So I am actually struggling to understand how they could be so disconnected from what is going on.
You were hitting at the heart of the matter, and that is consumer sentiment. The way that people feel about this economy isn't good, and that's got to flummox people who are in the jobs that you had previously, those who are in the White House. They can talk a good game about how things are going. You can have Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, lash out at Congress people saying, you know, the Dow is at 50,000, the S&P's at whatever number it's at. that doesn't ring true to a lot of people because so many people in this country aren't invested in the stock market. That is not simply what they're caring about at this moment in time because it is not their lived experience. So you're highlighting what's very true, which is there's this real disconnect between what's happening in the stock market, what's happening in the economy, and the way that the White House is managing that, and the way that the president's managing. We know well he's been reluctant to engage with this issue of affordability. He's going to go down to Georgia this week and continue this kind of small tour that he's been on of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and other states. But again, it's not a term that he's eager to embrace because simply put, the numbers, the data don't seem to match up with what he's saying on the campaign trail.
And Simone, the president's narcissism prevents him from being connected with ordinary Americans. They're not happy with the state of the economy. They're not happy with him. But he has this sense of grandiosity about himself that he is producing the greatest economy in the world, that he's the greatest president in the world. He wants to slap his name on everything. That is a function of his mental state, and it completely cuts him off from ordinary Americans.
It's always important to have people that will tell the president the truth. David, John, thank you very much. When we come back, with all the division in our country right now, we're always looking for ways we can come together, right? Well, Stephanie Ruhle talks about
a period of deep division. Right now, it is difficult to see how anything like unity is even possible. But it is critical for all of us to make the effort to try to come together. We can be the change that we want to see. Now, figuring out how we can do it is a big part of our series, Keeping the Faith. I'm honored to bring in Father James Martin. He's the editor-at-large of America Magazine and consultant to the Vatican's Office for Communication. His new book, you must read it, titled Work in Progress, Confessions of a Busboy, Dishwasher, Caddy, Usher, Factory Worker, Bank Teller, Corporate Tool, and Priest, is out now. I am so honored that you are here. A lot of people believe that our divisions are only because of what is happening in Washington. But is there something that is missing in our lives that somehow we can't see the humanity in one another?
Well, that's a big question. I think politics has a lot to do with it. I think it's exacerbated things. I think social media, which I'm on, and it's kind of a mixed blessing. I think that has something to do with it, people's ability to attack one another. But I think we've lost the ability to give people the benefit of the doubt, which is where I think we really need to start. Is
part of that because we now have people, or maybe we always did, but it's even more pronounced, that we don't even see as equals? We've decided there are members of society that are less than, and we're comfortable with eradicating them.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that we have considered some people as strangers, foreigners, other, right? Almost subhuman.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it's okay to hate people again. That's how it feels sometimes.
But how do you get back from that? Once you was like, yep, you're subhuman, you don't count. How do we get back from that? Because immigration is at the heart of this. We're seeing many churches try to solve for it. I don't know where we go, though.
Well, one way I think is to come to know people's stories, to come to know immigrants' stories. Pope Francis talked about the culture of encounter, really getting to know people, really meeting people. And, if you can't meet an immigrant, which is hard because they're all over the place, read their stories and try to get to know people who minister to them or work with them.
Strangers are just friends we haven't met yet.
Yeah, and, Jesus says we're supposed to love our neighbor, and that includes people that, might seem different than we are at first blush.
Then why do you think so many people of the Christian faith, why do you think so many people in the evangelical community are okay with this?
I don't know. I mean, the Gospels are pretty clear. Jesus says, when you welcome me, you welcome the stranger, and when you don't welcome me, you don't welcome the stranger. You don't need to have a PhD in New Testament studies to understand this stuff.
I want to turn to your book because you had a very, very different life. I just laid it out before you became a priest. And this book is all about that journey. Why was it important to write it now?
Yeah, I wanted to write a story about how my summer jobs prepared me to become a Jesuit priest and also tell some funny stories and some life lessons. I think one of the reasons I wrote it is to show that God can be at work, whether you're a busboy, a reporter, a teacher, an attorney, or even a priest, how God is at work through all these experiences that we had in our past.
So you're saying you're just a regular person?
I am definitely a regular person.
The President of the United States, on occasion, watches this show. What would your message be to him?
Gosh, I might say, think about the people that you are demonizing at times, and think about how it feels to be demonized, and come to know them as your brothers and sisters. Come to get to know migrants and refugees in particular. That's what I might say.
Do you have faith that we're going to turn the corner? Where do you find hope right now?
Well, you know, the message of the resurrection, I'm Christian, is nothing is impossible with God. And I think things can change on a dime. And really, it is about trying to come to understand people and understand their stories. That's one reason Jesus taught in stories and in parables. Arguments and debates, I think, sometimes close our minds down. Stories open them up.
And that would be for your message to people who are not Catholic or people who are not of faith at all. The answer is just get to know people?
Get to know people and try to put yourself in their shoes. I used to work with refugees for 2 years in Nairobi, Kenya. And I would often say to people, what would you do? You know, if your family was facing warfare or famine or violence, you would do the same thing. You would try to move somewhere more safe. And I think when you put yourself in people's shoes and see what they're trying to do, you can understand them a little better. Before I let you go, I do want to ask you about the Super Bowl. Not the game, but Bad Bunny. A lot of conservatives called his halftime show divisive. They called it political. But to me, the most important message of the night was on full display in English at the end of the performance, where it said, the only thing more powerful than hate is love. You have preached this for years. What was your reaction when you saw it? Clearly, we know my reaction. I was delighted because I thought it distilled that message and that music into one phrase, one easy-to-remember phrase, and he is 100% right. Is that something that we all have to remember? Because the idea of love is often sort of like weakened or feminized, but it couldn't be more powerful. Well, the Catholic activist Dorothy Day used to say that love might seem sweet and, you know, gentle, but love in action is really tough. She was quoting Dostoevsky. You know, love in action, really loving someone and going the extra mile and trying to stand in their shoes is tough. One of my friends, Jim Keenan, who's a Jesuit moral theology professor, said that compassion and love is, I love this, entering into